It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. It's Friday and it's time for our Agile Not So Agile episode of the Daily Stand Up. So, I came across a story again. Now, I haven't read this story in a long time, but I remember the last time I read it. It made me a little emotional, so I'll apologize in advance if that happens. The story is called Push Ups and Donuts. There was a certain professor of theology named Dr. Christensen, a studious man who taught at a small college in the western United States. Dr. Christensen taught the required survey course on Christianity in this particular institution. Every student was required to take the course his or her freshman year, regardless of their major. Although Dr. Christensen tried hard to communicate the essence of gospel principles in his class, he found that most of his students looked upon the course as required drudgery. Despite his best efforts, most students refused to take his theology class seriously. And this year, Dr. Christensen had a special student named Steve. Steve was only a freshman, but he was studying with the intent of going on to a seminary for deeper ministry. Steve was wildly popular. He was well liked. He was an imposing physical specimen. He was now the starting center on the school's football team and was the best student in the professor's class. One day, Dr. Christensen asked Steve to stay after class so they could chat. "Steve, how many push-ups can you do?" He replied, "I do about 200 every night." 200? That's really good, Steve, Dr. Christensen said, "but do you think you could do 300? Steve replied, "I don't know. I've never done 300 at a time." "But do you think you could?" again asked Dr. Christensen. "Well, I sure could try," said Steve. "Could you do 300 if we broke it into sets of 10? I have a class project of mine, and I need you to do about 300 push-ups in sets of 10 for this to work. Could you do it?" "I need you to tell me that you can do it," said the professor. Steve said, "Well, I think I can. You know what? Yeah, I can do it." Dr. Christensen said, "Good. I need you to do this on Friday. So let me explain what I have in mind." Friday came, and Steve got to class early and sat in the front of the room. When class started, the professor pulled out a giant, big box of donuts. These weren't just the normal kind of donuts. They were huge, the extra fancy kind, with cream centers, frosting swirls, you name it, it was there. Everyone was pretty excited it was Friday, the last class of the week, and they were going to get an early start on the weekend with a party in Dr. Christensen's class. Dr. Christensen went to the first girl in the first row and asked Cynthia, "Would you like to have one of these donuts?" Then Cynthia said, "Yes, please." Dr. Christensen then turned to Steve and asked, "Steve, would you please do 10 push-ups so that Cynthia can have a donut?" "Sure." Steve jumped down from his desk, did a quick 10. Then Steve again sat back at his desk, and Dr. Christensen placed a donut on Cynthia's desk. Dr. Christensen then went to Joe, the next person, and asked, "Joe, would you like a donut?" Joe said, "Yes, Dr. Christensen." Dr. Christensen turned to Steve and said, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so Joe can have a donut?" Steve did 10 additional push-ups. Joe got a donut. And so it went, down the first aisle. Steve did 10 push-ups for every single person before they got their donut. Walking down the second aisle, Dr. Christensen came to Scott. Scott was on the basketball team and was in as good a condition as Steve was. He was also very popular and never lacking for companionship. When the professor asked, "Scott, do you want a donut?" Scott's reply was, "Yeah, but I can do my own push-ups." Dr. Christensen firmly said, "No, Steve has to do them." Then Scott said, "Well, then I don't want one." Dr. Christensen shrugged and turned to Steve and asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so Scott can have a donut that he really doesn't want?" With perfect obedience, Steve started to do 10 push-ups. Scott said, "Hey, I said I didn't want one." Dr. Christensen said, "Look, this is my classroom, my class, my desks, my donuts, my rules. Just leave it on your desk." And he put the donut on Scott's desk. Now, by this time, Steve had begun to slow down a little. He just stayed on the floor in between sets because it took a lot of effort getting up and down. You could start to see a little perspiration coming out from around his brow. Dr. Christensen started down the third row. Now the students were beginning to get a little angry. Dr. Christensen asked Jenny, Jenny, do you want a donut? Sternly, Jenny said, no. Then Dr. Christensen asked Steve, Steve, would you please do 10 more push ups so Jenny can have a donut that she really doesn't want? Steve did 10, and Jenny got a donut. By now, there was a growing sense of uneasiness filling the room. The students were beginning to say no, and there were all these uneaten donuts left on desks. Steve also had to really start putting forth a lot of extra effort to get these push ups done for each donut that was left. There began to be a small pool of sweat on the floor beneath his face. His arms and brow were beginning to get red because of the physical effort that he was exerting. Dr. Christensen turned to Robert, who was the most vocal unbeliever of any religion in the class. To watch Steve do each push up to make sure he did full. So Dr. Christensen asked Robert, who was the most vocal unbeliever in the class, to watch Steve do each push up to make sure he did the full 10 push ups in a set because he couldn't bear to watch all Steve's work for all those uneaten donuts. He sent Robert over to where Steve was so that Robert could count each set and watch Steve closely. Dr. Christensen started down the fourth row. During his class, however, some students from other classes had wandered in and sat down along the radiators and on the steps that ran down the sides of the room. When the professor realized this, he did a quick count and saw that there were 34 students in the room. He started to worry if Steve would be able to make it. Dr. Christensen went down to the next person and the next and the next. Near the end of that row, Steve was really having a rough time. It was taking a lot more time to complete each set. Steve asked Dr. Christensen, do I have to make my nose touch on each one? Dr. Christensen thought for a moment and said, well, they're your push-ups. You're in charge now. You can do them any way you want. And Dr. Christensen went on. A few moments later, Jason, a recent transfer student, came into the room and was about to come in when all the students yelled in one voice, no, don't come in, stay out. Jason didn't know what was going on. Steve picked up his head and said, no, let him come in. Professor Christensen said, you realize that if Jason comes in, you'll have to do 10 push-ups for him. Steve said, yes, let him come in. Give him his donut. Dr. Christensen said, okay, Steve. I'll let you get Jason's out of the way right now. Jason, do you want a donut? Jason, new to the room, hardly knew what was going on. Yes, he said, give me a donut. Steve, will you do 10 push-ups so that Jason can have his donut? Steve did 10 push-ups very slowly and with really great effort. Jason was bewildered, and he was handed a donut and sat down. Dr. Christensen finished the fourth row and started on those visitors that are seated along the stairs. Steve's arms were visibly shaking with each push-up in a struggle to lift himself against the force of gravity. By this time, sweat was profusely dropping off his face. There was no sound except his heavy breathing, and there was not a dry eye in the room. The last two students in the room were two young women, both were cheerleaders and very popular. Dr. Christensen went to Linda first. She was the second to last and asked Linda, Linda, do you want a donut? Linda very sadly said, no, thank you. Professor Christensen quietly asked Steve, Steve, will you please do 10 push-ups so that Linda can have a donut she doesn't want? Grunting from the effort, Steve did 10 very slow push-ups for Linda. Then Dr. Christensen turned to the last girl, Susan. Susan, do you want a donut? Susan, with tears falling down her face, really crying hard, said, Dr. Christensen, why can't I help him? Dr. Christensen, with tears in his own, said, no, Steve has to do this alone. I've given him a task, and he's in charge of seeing that everyone has an opportunity for a donut, whether they want it or not. When I decided to have a party this last day of class, I looked at my grade book. Steve is the only student with a perfect grade. Everyone else has failed a test, skipped class, or offered me work that wasn't up to par. Steve told me in football practice when a player messes up, He has to do push ups. I told Steve that none of you could come to my party unless he paid the price by doing the push ups. He and I made a deal so that you could have the donuts. Steve, will you do 10 push ups so Susan can have a donut? As Steve very slowly finished the last push up, with the understanding that he had accomplished all that was required of him, having done 350 push ups, his arms buckled beneath him and he fell to the floor. Dr. Christensen turned to the room and said, and so it was. Some things don't need a full sermon or advice to get the point across. Sometimes we have to realize that someone has made a sacrifice for each of us. And as hard as it is for us to understand and comprehend exactly how far someone will go to help us be successful both in life and in love and in family and in all the things we need to do, I think it's important for us to recognize that there's power behind our decisions, and it's sometimes we take for granted some of the most important gifts that have been given to us. So my advice for you this weekend, my goal for you, is to be grateful for the gifts you've been given. Seek out opportunities to help others, and never let those gifts that have been given to you without you even asking, whether you wanted them or not, go for granted, because someone has gone out of their way to make sure that one of those donuts was for you. Hope you have an amazing weekend, and we'll talk again on Monday. Until then, stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile. Do take care.